Good morning, everybody. We're just going to give everyone a couple minutes to get into the room. Chris, it looks like we have about 17 or 18 participants. We'll give them another couple minutes.
Terrific. Say hello to Robert, who sent us a greeting in the chat.
Hey, Robert, you're the first one.
Welcome, welcome, Robert. Thanks for joining us from San Bernardino.
All right, enough for the time. For everyone else's time, we'll get started. Well, good morning, everyone, and I guess good afternoon to some. We're really grateful that you're all able to join us today for our Institutional Insights webinar. For those of you that have not had the opportunity to meet, my name is Jesse Crane, and I'm a member of Beacon Pointe's Institutional Consulting Group. And we're really excited to have today's webinar to discuss perspectives on philanthropy and the implications of the 2022 Giving Report. Beacon Pointe serves as an investment consultant for several nonprofit organizations, and we provide services to our clients on investments and corporate governance, and we understand and support the importance of fundraising, especially given today's environment. And there are a lot of challenges facing a lot of the organizations we work with. And so with that, I'm excited to welcome Chris Looney from CCS Fundraising to the webinar. Chris is a managing director at CCS and is responsible for running the firm's Southern California operations. During his 20+ year career, Chris has assisted thousands of organizations, both large and small, in raising hundreds of millions of dollars. Just a couple of quick housekeeping items. If you have any questions during the webinar, please feel free to email them to me at jcrane@beaconpointe.com. You can see that there on the screen. Robin's also going to put my email in the chat. Send them in during the presentation or send them in via the chat, and we'll do our best to try to get to them. But if we don't, we'll respond shortly after. Additionally, if you have suggestions on future topics you'd like covered during these institutional insights, please send them our way. We'd love to hear from you. And also note the recording, the presentation is being recorded, and we'll send you a copy of the recording once it's been approved by CCS and Beacon Pointe's compliance team. Without any further delays, Chris, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks, Jesse. And it's so delightful to be with everyone today. It's such a great privilege to be able to talk about philanthropy, a subject near and dear to my heart. CCS has been a part of this Giving USA report now for almost the entirety of our 75-year history as a firm serving the needs of the nonprofit industry and fundraising. What's really wonderful from my perspective about this presentation today, a couple of things. One is that I actually sit on the board of Giving USA, the Giving USA Foundation, and the Giving Institute. So I'm very intimately involved in raising the money that actually helps generate this report year in and year out. So it's a labor of love from that perspective. But also being able to partner up with Beacon Pointe is particularly special because I've been with CCS 25 years, and it was in year number 1 of my work with CCS that I came to know one of the principals of Beacon Point and was introduced to the firm and knew them because they were so involved in the nonprofit community here in Orange County, where our office is located. So it's just a great time. And what I did want to say about the report before we go into the numbers is that it's the longest running report on philanthropy in existence, goes back decades, and has been tracking philanthropy over that time. And you know, the evolution of philanthropy is amazing because it gets more and more mature every year. The report gets more mature, but so do us fundraisers in terms of our capacity to understand the data, use the data, predict what might happen, and look back and learn from history so as to be better and smarter about the work that we do in the future. So it's an amazing report. We're going to give you the sort of links that will allow you to have access to this information. I don't have the opportunity in a short amount of time to really dig in. This, as you can see, is a very thick book, right? So there's lots of great stuff to dig into. I only get to cover the major themes and trends of it, which hopefully will just whet your appetite for something more, and you'll have that opportunity to do so. But the important news of the day, not to bury the lead any further, is that giving did remain very strong in 2021 and continues what we've seen to be a very strong giving pattern in America over the last several years, even through the choppiness of the pandemic and everything else. Largely, I would imagine because the market performed very strongly in those years. But our challenge this past year was inflation. So despite the fact that you see Americans in all forms gave nearly $500 billion away last year alone, which seems wonderful and great. And it is nice that it was almost a 4% increase year over year. But when you factor in inflation, which, as we know, was a big part of our life these past months and past year or so, giving was relatively flat at less than 1%. So that's not great to see. Normally, there's a line that we often show, which is the giving against the inflation rate, and it would have shown that giving was relatively flat this year. Another feature that I want to highlight to everyone, and is concerning, even though philanthropy is strong, is the fact that we're seeing dollars up and donors down. What do I mean by that? Though total dollars given to charity by individuals now, not the full philanthropic picture, but just individuals, even though those dollars given last year and the years before have been up, the total number of individuals contributing to that amount has been decreasing. So what does that mean? The average gift is higher, but the number of donors is smaller. And we have to figure out a way to overcome that, to plug more Americans into giving at any level. We have this DNA historically of Americans being generous and giving, and we don't want to lose that DNA that we've been building for decades, if not centuries. So one of the things that we as fundraisers need to really focus on and unlock is how we can, at our individual organizations, turn the tide of giving, not just in contributing more dollars, but also in contributing, having a growing number of donors, inclusive of retention, but also new donors coming onto the scene. So I know we can do it. I know we can do it. Jesse, did you have any questions that you wanted to ask at this moment, or should I keep going?
No, I'll let you cover this, and then a few questions have come in from the chat. So I'll let you.
Awesome.
So I'll let you cover this, and then I'll jump in.
Perfect. That's great. So on this slide, I did want to make it known, in case there are some that are sort of new to philanthropy, that individuals do provide the vast majority of giving to the sector, and it's measured at about 67% coming from individuals, in distinction from bequests, giving from foundations, giving from corporations. In the last year, bequests did decline year over year. And part of it was that we had record levels of giving from bequests in 2020. So it's natural that there would have been a bit of a decline in 2021. Nothing unusual about that, unpredictable as bequest giving can be year over year. But interestingly, in corporate giving, there was particular strength, mainly because of the strength of corporate pre-tax dollars last year. It was a good year for many corporations, and their giving grew at an 18.3% level, so pretty significantly over the year before. All four sources did experience positive two-year growth, though. So there was a positive growth even when adjusting for inflation.
Chris, this the 67% that is making up individual giving, does that include gifts from family foundations?
It's such a good point, because the way that Giving USA reports individual giving leads one to believe that that's the full extent of individual participation in the marketplace. But what we also know is that individuals sourced the bequest amount, right? So those gifts that came from people that had passed on and were going to organizations adds another 9% to that statistic. So 67 up 9 then. And then within that foundation arena there, about half of that comes from family foundations, family offices, DAFS, and funding in that way. So you're talking about nearly 90% of giving coming from individuals. That doesn't mean that your organization might not have a more diverse revenue picture, right? Corporate giving might be higher, foundation giving might be higher, but on the whole, individuals are giving away 90% of every dollar given to charity.
Interesting. I think that's a lot different than what most would assume, right? I think most people think that the donations come from the corporations, right?
Right.
And that's the way. So it's surprising to see this, and I think the statistics are really interesting. In your CCS's first look, we see that the mega gifts by individuals represented about 5% of all giving by individuals, making up 14.9 billion. Can you share what that means? In your report, you talked about large gifts from individuals, but maybe elaborate a little bit more on that for us.
Yeah, mega gifts are interesting. They're more frequent than they've ever been. Part of the challenge of the number is that it's representative of all of those $100 million, billion-dollar gifts that are made. And it sounds silly to think billions of dollars are given away by an individual, right? But they are. We think about Mackenzie Scott, we think about the Gates Foundation, where they're pushing money over from their own personal resources into charity or into a foundation. Those count, those dollars count. So we know that mega gifts made up about 5% of all giving from individuals last year. That's about $15 billion of the total. And that's a huge amount, and that amount will fluctuate dramatically year over year. I anticipate that it will be an increasingly large amount as baby boomers continue to age and pass on their wealth to charity. And so I would not be surprised to see the bequest amount and the mega gift amount grow dramatically in the coming years. It's just we're seeing increasing frequency. People with extraordinary wealth who have either learned to be generous or have been told to be generous or know that it's right to be generous and are pushing significant percentages of their portfolio, their wealth over to charity. Any others that we should tackle at this moment, Jesse, or should we?
Oh, I think that's great. Again, if you guys have questions, for those of you on the line, feel free to send them via email and or in the chat.
Great, wonderful. Well, on the next slide, what we see is a breakdown of how giving came through the different sectors of the nonprofit economy. There are 10 measured sectors, and giving grew in 6 out of the 10 of them. What's important to know is that historically, the largest share of charitable dollars does go to religion, which includes congregations, missions, religious media, and other related organizations. But that share has been decreasing substantially over the last decade. I can remember vividly just a couple of years ago, it seemed, where religion accounted for 33, 34, 35% of the overall giving pie. So where's it going? Well, it's going to all of these other sectors. It's going actually probably into a lot of DAFS, donor advised funds, in a lot of other spaces. But we are seeing some rebounding in some of the subsectors, because it was interesting last year how many of these sectors were hard hit because of the pandemic, like arts and culture, humanities, that suffered substantially during the pandemic as people were not able to gather. Similarly for religious institutions as well. Now that there's that capacity to be in front of an audience, to re-engage with donors in a more traditional setting through in-person and hybrid events, we're seeing certain sectors like arts and culture, like religion, rebound a bit. Giving to health recovered in 2021 as well. Surprisingly, we saw a dip in giving to health, which was just blew my mind last year in the face of a pandemic, that giving to health actually went down in 2020 as opposed to went up. And part of it, as I rationalize it, is that money was pulled from health into more emergency services, homeless shelters, and other areas that were really taking care of those hardest hit. It was unfortunate to see the dip in healthcare, but it makes sense too when you think about the number of procedures that were put off, people not receiving the same sort of life-saving care to the degree that they were, with all of those surgeries being delayed and basic care in many ways being delayed in favor of taking care of COVID patients, right? So it was just a different time. Very interesting how that influences giving. But there were certainly great rebounds as a result of 2021. In education, for example, saw great growth in 2020, surprisingly, but growth wasn't as high in 2021.
Chris, sorry to interrupt you, but for those 4 sectors that we saw decreases, right? 6 out of 10 grew, but the 4 that didn't. What do we think? What do we think that means for the nonprofit professionals in those sectors, or the organizations in those sectors?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't read too much into it. There's always shifting of priorities among Americans, and a lot of it has to do with the kinds of economic events that are happening. We know that a lot more money was going into public society benefit and human service as a result of some of the moves toward equity and greater justice. Right, so those kinds of events do dramatically impact the giving landscape. But these shifts were not monumental shifts. These were just, I think, more traditional gyrations and preferences of Americans year over year. So I wouldn't get too overly concerned about, for example, the fact that we saw environment and animal efforts gaining momentum. That's great, but a lot of that will probably diminish as we see people maybe becoming a little more comfortable with government's role back in environmental affairs. When there was a pullback of government interest in pursuing certain environmental causes, that causes people to get concerned and start throwing money at a particular challenge or concern. So, we just have to be mindful of the political movements and how that influences giving among certain sectors.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. And, I think it's important too to see some of the year-over-year changes, both by a source and then by recipient, which you can see here on the screen. During the last 2 years, individual giving, foundation giving have played an outsized role in philanthropy. Giving by individuals and foundations both grew in current dollars. Both individual and foundation giving achieved near record highs when adjusting for inflation. So we talked about the large gifts being an influencing factor, 5% of all individual giving coming from those large gifts. But as we drill down into the data, foundations, what I feel good about was the fact that foundations maintain their giving patterns that they were forced sort of into during the pandemic, during the height of the pandemic, which meant they were allowing greater flexibility, and they were also allowing for greater innovation investments. So they focused more on unrestricted giving, and they reduced their requirements for many organizations to receive funds. And I felt that was a very helpful move in philanthropy to kind of take down some of those barriers that had existed pre-pandemic to accessing foundation resources. So
is that a trend that you think will continue? I know a lot of the organizations that we work with and have been part of, always want to raise unrestricted funds, right? But sometimes donors aren't always as willing to give unrestricted funds because they like to dedicate their funds to something that was near and dear to their heart. But the organizations really need them. And I think COVID, if anything, showed nonprofits and foundations the benefit of that. So do you think that's a trend likely to continue, or what's been your take so far?
It could be. I think it all depends on the pressure that is put toward those foundations and their sort of responsibilities in terms of being good stewards of these enormous sums of money that they're responsible for. I mean, obviously, they all want to protect their assets so they can continue to be generous far into the future, and no one wants to put them at financial risk of not being able to fulfill their mission. But at the same time, I know it's going to be very easy for many of these foundations to sort of jump back into their comfort space of being more protective of their dollars. And I think a lot of it will depend on the external environment that exists. Will an upcoming change in the economic environment cause them to continue their patterns? Will pressure from lobbying or advocacy opportunities from within the nonprofit space pressure them to continue these practices of being less restrictive and more open? I hope so. But, I do also know, having been around the block a couple of times through the seesaws of life, that these organizations, individuals, they find their way back to sort of comfortable patterns. So there have to be policy changes, probably ultimately, to force some foundations to change their approach to giving, as well as what we're going to be talking about on this next slide, which is the emergence, if you will, of donor advised funds onto the philanthropic scene, and sort of the titanic changes that are happening because of giving into these donor advised funds and funds at community foundations as well. It has changed the picture quite a bit for philanthropy. And I know that among all of the foundation giving, there's probably no area that we're seeing more change in terms of policy, government regulation, thinking, and contemplating because there's enormous pressure for DAFs and for community foundations to spend what they have, not sit on what they have, but to spend on, and it's a tension, right? There's good arguments on both sides. I certainly am not going to, say one side or the other is right or wrong. They're both right. They both want to continue to do good things for the community. But there's some pressure. And so this is where I see the excitement happening in the future, where I see big changes happening, because there's no question in my mind that DAFs, donor advised funds, and community foundation work and assets will continue to grow dramatically as they have. It's not going to be cryptocurrency giving near term that changes the face of philanthropy. It's going to be donor advised funds, and both contributions to DAFs and grants rose substantially in 2020, 2021 as well. And we're talking about increases up 20-30% year over year, which is pretty remarkable. The highest reported increases on record to date. And those trends are expected to continue and not sort of diminish substantially over the next 3 to 5 year period. And so the question, of course, is how accessible are those DAFs to the nonprofit space? Because as you know, it really is a system where the donor shifts money into the DAF, and then theoretically the money comes from the DAF to go out into the philanthropic community to be put to good work. That doesn't have to happen within a set period of time. It's at the donor discretion to determine when and how those funds are distributed. So the challenge is it's not immediate use necessarily. And so there's more pressure to put timelines, to put minimum distributions, to put all kinds of things against those. And when that happens, it's not if, but when, because there's just not going to be an opportunity to have that much money sitting on the sidelines, not doing what it was intended to do more immediately. I think it'll be a huge influx of money going into the charitable sector, which few of us in that space can complain about for sure. But I would expect that giving from DAFs to certainly continue to grow in the future. And we're also seeing, just in terms of trends that we want to report out on to you all, the continued focus and increased giving that we're seeing in the space of equity and justice, the DEI lens that has certainly been an important one for the nonprofit world. And we're giving many presentations these days about how organizations need to have that DEI lens when they are approaching individual donors, when they're approaching foundations, because and when I say DEI lens, it's not just on programs that are offered, but how the organization itself looks. Does the board reflect the community in which it works? Does the institutional leadership on the staff side reflect the diversity of the community? Do the programs have fairness and equity to them? All questions that are becoming increasingly important to donors.
Chris, it looks like you might have just picked the next quarter's institutional insight topic.
Good.
Something that I think could be very interesting to our conversations as well as our clients.
Good. I hope so. That would be a great topic, because it's one that we have already sort of put out into the universe, most recently with the California Community Foundation as being a panelist, and just that they provided great insights into their psyche, when they receive requests for funding, how the DEI lens should be perceived in sort of the materials that are sent to them and communicated to them. So I would love that. Let's do that. But for now, I just want to make sure that everyone has access to the reports that are available to them so they can dig more into some of these particular questions.
Absolutely. I mean, Chris, this has been great, and I think really helpful to highlight some of the key takeaways. If you had to summarize, what would you say were the key takeaways for you outside of the donor advised fund? What would you say? And maybe what surprised you most, right? You've probably read this report for the last, I don't know, 10, 15, 20 years. What would you say surprised you the most this year?
Yeah, I suppose that giving didn't really exceed inflation, that inflation got the better of us, even in 2021 numbers. I can only imagine what 2022 is going to look like, because I feel like the intensity of the inflation conversation kind of started with this year in January, maybe. But I think that was a key takeaway. Wow, it just didn't grow enough to even surpass inflation. Secondly, that we continue to struggle with the number of donors declining in America. And this is an experience that we're seeing with our clients as well. The number of donors declining year over year. They're still raising more money, right? That is an unfortunate trend, continues to surprise me. I just don't know how to unlock more individual giving across, all Americans.
And I guess out of the trends, I mean, out of all the stuff that you guys have put together and your team's first look at it, what do you think is most important for nonprofit professionals to focus on today?
Yeah, that's such a good question. Everything under the sun is important, right? But retention is critical. How to retain your donors? Don't lose them. They're near impossible to replace. So, double up your efforts to retain your donors. Be constantly finding new ways to acquire new donors. I think those two things are important. Trends, we're seeing just a lot of conversations around cryptocurrency and the capacity to be ready to receive that. It was a lot more hype months ago when it was high flying, but it will continue to be present in our conversations, and for some donors it will be important to pursue. And gift planning is key too. We are on the verge or in the middle of the largest intergenerational transfer of wealth in recorded history, and a lot of that money does not have to go from one generation to the next, but from one generation to nonprofit. So, get in line, have those conversations. Make sure your sign is open for business when it comes to receiving legacy commitments and putting, that institution into the beneficiaries of 401ks, IRAs, life insurance, but also just a percentage of someone's remainder of their estate, whatever it needs to be. Have those conversations with your best donors because someone else will if it's not you.
Sure. No, that's helpful. And I think that sort of answers the one last question we had about sort of, seeing different organizations embrace change and what, how they're adapting. Someone had emailed that question in. Any additional strategies that are new that you've seen employed that you'd highlight today?
Well, I suppose it's everything from, engagement of your donors, increasing that engagement through a variety of in-person now and hybrid events. We can't be stuck in any old ways that we might have been stuck pre-pandemic. We've learned and we need to continue to evolve. I think the technological advancements of giving continue to be the place to spend your resources, perfect your message, get it out there into the universe through social media, be open for business online, be state of the art when it comes to your appeals, virtual, electronic. This is just the time to make sure that you're not behind the curve in finding and communicating with your prospects. Because it's harder and harder to get people to show up in person, but the benefit is that they're easier and easier and more accessible in other venues. So finding those venues is really where we spend a lot of time focusing our work.
That's great. I think that's a great way. Unless there are any other questions that come through at the the last couple seconds here, I think we're sort of right on time, keeping it right at about 30 minutes. Any last takes, any last reactions, anything else you'd want to leave the group with?
Yeah, I mean, the information is out there about how to take advantage of the current market environment. Whether you anticipate harder days ahead or better news coming out, either way, I think that there is a way to be prepared to do good fundraising work, no matter what the market environment is. And even though I know there's a lot of concern out there, the ups and downs, the uncertainty of it all is what is most challenging to fundraising. It's not an up market or a down market, it's the uncertain market. So embrace it. There's nothing else you can do. Double down your conversations with your donors, be more engaged and together with them in those moments of uncertainty. Because what I know for sure is that the uncertainty doesn't help the clients of your nonprofit. That there is 100% certainty that when the economy isn't great or is uncertain like this, it's not the wealthiest that are taking the hardest hits. It's actually those that are the most vulnerable and probably need your services most. So the messaging around that just needs to be tightened up and shared with your best supporters.
That's awesome. Chris, thanks so much for your time today. This has been great. I think this has just been a phenomenal presentation for our clients. And like I said in the beginning of it, we'll get everybody a copy of the presentation as well as a copy of the snapshot of the report. And if there are questions that come in through the email afterwards, we'll make sure to get them a copy to you. And look forward to doing it again soon. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Jesse. Thanks, everyone.